Hello and welcome to the Runna Podcast. Today we chatted to head physio and coach at Runna, Adrian D'Costa. We had such a valuable conversation, blending science-backed physiotherapy and practical coaching advice.
We spoke through the top 3 running injuries that Adrian sees: runner's knee, shin splints, and IT band syndrome. And we chat through what they are, how to prevent them, and then also how to recover from them as well. You're going to love listening to today's episode.
Hey Adrian, how are you?
Hey Anya, I'm good. How are you?
I'm great. It's amazing to have you back in, the man, the myth. You've helped so much of London out with so many injuries, including myself actually.
No, it's good to be back. Always great to share some education and tips around, injury and how to get people moving better.
Exactly, and that's what we're going to dive into today. I wanted to ask you, what is the most common running injury you seem to face?
For sure. I think traditionally it's always been runner's knee. The research will show that it's like 26% of running related injuries is runner's knee. But because there's so many people getting into running now, what we're seeing a massive surge on, and probably in clinic for us, almost on a one-to-one basis, we might see one runner's knee for then one shin splint injury or one bone stress injury. So shin splints is a variation of bone stress, or a type of bone stress rather. So, we're seeing a massive spike in bone stress injuries and shin splints being the main one of those.
So I guess starting with runner's knee, what is runner's knee?
Yeah, so runner's knee by definition is pain around the kneecap or behind the kneecap. So it's a blanket term. There's a lot of different factors that can impact it, from training to your anatomy makeup, to strength. But it's a factor of a few different things coming together, and it's the blanket terminology. So runner's knee is the sort of like more street term, if you want to call it that, and then the actual sort of like by definition is called patellofemoral pain. So that's where the pain around the kneecap and behind the kneecap is sort of comes from.
And is that the kind of the connecting tissues into the kneecap itself that are causing that pain?
It's actually the pain on how the kneecap is articulating with the underlying joint. So it can be influenced by connective tissue. So it could be influenced by your quadricep patella above your knee and your quad mechanism. It could be impacted by your patella tendon, which lives below the knee. It can also be impacted by the hip. So there are a few things. And also the shape of your patella. So, there's anatomical variation. So for you, Ben, you might have a patella, which is your kneecap, that fits really nicely in the groove in the joint below. But then Anya might have a shallow groove, and then the patella floats a little bit above. So that creates a little bit of instability, which means she might be a little bit more predisposed to having patellofemoral pain or runner's knee.
I see. And given that we can't adjust the way our kneecap intersects with our
Depends where you go. I'm sure there's someone somewhere that would do that, but let's go with that because that's my preference.
Agree. So therefore, what can a runner do to avoid seeing issues around their kneecap and around runner's knee?
For sure. I think the biggest thing that we know from the research, from the data, is load management from training. Like, if your training plan is well structured, has really good increments with load, and load is not just the volume and how much you run, it's also the intensity of how much you run. So, if you look at volume being one building block in a bucket where you're throwing load in, when you add in intensity, depending on how fast that run is, if it's going into a steady run or a tempo, progressive interval, all of a sudden you're going from 2xing, 3xing, maybe 8 or 10xing when you're doing a hard interval session, because now the load relationship is not linear because you're working super hard. So I think if you can manage your running load overall, have a good training plan, jump on an incredible app like Runna, that has a really nice way of creating accountability. You can track where things are going well. But it's also the adaptation of that runner learning about themselves, because no two runners will respond to load the same way. So, the classic sort of 10% rule of like, you should increase your load by 10% might work well for most people, but might not for some. Some people might not tolerate 10%. Some people can go out there and run incredible amounts and keep stacking on it and do pretty well. So there's a lot of variation between people. So I think being able to track how your body's responding to load, what that potential percentage increase is, that's a huge thing there for like managing or at least tracking the ability to minimize runner's knee.
So do you think it's the like intensity, that speed work, tempo things that tend to flare up runner's knee?
I would say intensity has a bigger factor than just bringing in pure volume. Like if you went for a 10K hard run, not having done that before, versus running 5 to 10K, but then you decide to do 14K one weekend, that's going to have a smaller impact in the overall load that goes into your body because you're still kind of used to it. Whereas like doing 10K hard, almost shaving a minute per kilometer on pace, that's going to really increase the force that goes through the knee joint.
And I guess force is also not just around the intensity with reference to the pace that you're running, but also maybe the elevation. Because running uphill, am I right in thinking, is going to create less impact because you're almost falling from a lower height to the floor because it meets your foot earlier. Yeah. Whereas going downhill is going to be the most aggressive from an impact perspective.
100%. I think I couldn't have said it better. When you're going uphill, you're predominantly a little bit more hip biased. So your glute is the powerhouse muscle alongside your hamstring that is helping you propel uphill. So it's a bit more hip dominant. As you go downhill, the center of mass shifts a little bit. Your knee ends up leading in terms of contact and where it is. So your knee will work harder as you go downhill. That quadricep complex, which is what's connecting onto that kneecap, is having to like really stabilize super hard, but also stabilize in a position where the muscle's a little bit more lengthened out. So it requires that quadricep to be super strong in order to make sure that that knee joint now is not taking on any added force that the quadricep muscle should have been doing.
Yeah, I can definitely speak from first-hand experience when I've done more faster running downhill. It really takes it out the quads. Yeah. In terms of then prevention, what can one do maybe if they start to notice some runner's knee type symptoms coming on, or even they're just wanting to kind of like really avoid seeing such a common running injury, other than load management and kind of making sure that we're training in the right way and building up both the volume and the intensity? What could one do to try and avoid runner's knee coming on or prevent it in the first place?
So we kind of alluded to it, which is strength, right? So we know the quadricep is going to be the main connector onto that kneecap. And in many ways, the purpose of your kneecap is to act like a pulley for this quadricep muscle mechanism. So you got big, beautiful muscle, probably second biggest muscle in the body. The glute's the biggest. And then you've got the tendon below the kneecap. So it acts as a pulley to help sort of transmit that force and extend your knee out. So if you can get that quadricep muscle getting super strong in a variation of different positions. So people always look at a quadricep muscle and they go, well, I'll do a squat, but how can you vary that squat up? If you do a back squat, it has the quadricep working, but your glutes are working a bit harder. Whereas if you do a front squat, you're a little bit more upright. So now all of a sudden you are changing how that squat takes place, which muscles have to work harder. And then, then you look into variations like a split squat, which is a bit more unilateral, maybe a little bit more running specific, where you're trying to get that knee to work, but then you're going deeper into range and you look at it like a rainbow, right? Like if your quadricep muscle is like a rainbow, how can you attack different exercises to get every single color of the rainbow? So can you work it in isolation? Can you work it in conjunction with other muscles? Can you work it in ways that it has to stabilize? So can you mimic certain positions within the running gait cycle, but just also get super strong? Like if the goal is to get strong and to build force and strength, then that just comes down to your ability to progressively lift heavy and pull more intensity in, which a lot of runners are afraid of. So there's this classic thing: if I lift more weight, I'll get really chunky and bulky and I'll slow down. But it's not the case if you're also doing 60K a week. You're not getting that element of it versus someone who's a pure bodybuilder that probably does 10 minutes on a treadmill to get a bit of cardio in, or
And I think that's also the key point when it comes to like the strength and the analogy of the rainbow, which is completely true. I think if your goal is to be a bodybuilder and just build big quads, it doesn't really matter which of those movements you're doing, because all that matters is you want a big muscle. Whereas you need your quadricep to be good at running downhill, propelling you uphill, twisting and turning, being able to tolerate an explosive interval or a long, steady, slower run. So that literally is lots of different types of strength that we need to build, and therefore variety in that strength training is going to be the thing that we need to see that.
100%. If you look at a bodybuilder, their goal is to build size, hypertrophy. So they'll work in typically a slightly higher rep range where the muscle is going to get that hypertrophy and size. Those muscular cells start to get a bit more inflated like a balloon. Whereas when you're looking to build strength, you want to focus a bit more intensity, less on volume. And I think this is where a lot of runners get wrong, because they go, I'm running a marathon, I'm running a half marathon, I'm going to do 3 sets of 20 because I'm doing an endurance sport. Whilst the sport is endurance, the training doesn't necessarily have to be endurance. If you're trying to build strength, you want to work on building intensity. So can you progressively get down to working hard over 8 reps in a set, ideally down towards 5 or 6, depending on where you are in your training block and your experience. And then, like you said, the different variations of movements. Can you work the muscle concentrically, which is when the muscle fibers are shortening? Can you work it eccentrically, which is what happens every time you hit the ground and what the quadricep has to do? So something like a really good loaded step down when you're working on going super slow to lower the suspended leg is getting that quadricep to lengthen. You're mimicking some of the forces you're going to put through that knee as you're running. But then also, can you work it in ways where you're trying to push through immovable objects like isometric style movements where the muscles really, really engage. You're working super hard, but you're not necessarily getting the fatigue elements from it. And then plyometrics. How can you try and get that muscle engaging in plyometrics so you're getting it to shorten and stretch and get that sort of like power to go through it? So, it can be quite nuanced, but I think trying to get different variation, trying to also just make sure that you're working within your ability. Like if you've never done plyometrics and that's the first thing you're doing, probably shouldn't be doing that. Like just focus on the basics. And then start to build up as you understand how your strength work is interacting with your running training load, because they both have to coexist.
I think there's a key myth that you kind of uncovered there that's worth calling out, which is very much around the kind of rep ranges and strength training specifically, which is, I think, the common association, I think, would be that people who don't want to get bulky will lift lighter weights for a lot more reps.
Yeah.
With the assumption that if you do a heavier weight for fewer reps, you'll get bulky, which is the exact opposite of what you just spoke of.
Yeah, for sure. You're burning so much energy through the week when you're running. You're also burning so much energy when you're training. So it's not like a bodybuilder, for example, who might be consuming 5,000 or 6,000 calories a day trying to put on size. So I think it's a very, like you said, it's a classic sort of societal myth that this will happen, but it's not the case at all. Like you're burning so much, you'll put on lean mass as opposed to getting the sort of like bulk or the swell around the muscle.
Yeah, and I think also when you look at the elite end of marathon runners or whatever it's going to be, they'll be really prioritizing their strength training. But I don't also think the common body shape of an elite marathon runner is a big chunky bodybuilder. So I think when done in the right way, as you describe, it's also not going to lead to those knock-on effects that maybe are undesirable for some.
Yeah.
Moving on to the other common running injury you mentioned, shin splints.
Yeah.
Or bone stress injuries. Talk us through what are shin splints.
Yeah, for sure. So shin splints is essentially stress on your bone. So the by definition it's called medial tibial stress syndrome. Although you can get it, whilst it's more common on the inside or the inner corner of your knee, you can also get it at your tibia. You can also get it at the front of your tibia or your shin bone. And essentially it's when your bone isn't coping with your training. So when there isn't adequate recovery between subsequent sessions, your bone starts to go through a period where it doesn't sort of regenerate well enough. So you've got two cells in your bones. You've got bone building cells and you've got bone decay cells, and you need both of them to live hand in hand. And in an ideal situation, you got a nice, let's call it a 2-to-1 ratio of 2 bone building cells to 1 bone decay cell. So that means your bone turnover is really good. The bone stays strong. So most of us know this as bone mineral density. It's a nice strong bone that can tolerate the forces. As you go through bringing training in, and I'm speaking purely to training, but there's a lot of factors. This is like a super nuanced sort of injury. But when you're bringing in a lot of training and you're going through that change, all of a sudden that ratio starts to get warped. Your bone's not coping with the demands, and then your bone starts to go through a period of stress. And that stress can be happening either from the outside of the bone, so you start to get some swelling and stress on the outside of your bone, but also what we know now is it can happen from within the bone, through the marrow, sort of going from the inside out. And these are the sort of more harder ones to pick up because your pain sensitive tissue is on the outside of the bone, and on the inside of the bone you don't have any pain sensitive tissue. So if it's manifesting inside out, sometimes people don't pick this up till it's quite too late, and then it's not a bone stress response, it ends up being a bone stress fracture. So it's a spectrum where you go from a response and then that grades up all the way up into a bone stress fracture, which we don't want. That's a miserable road to go down for a lot of runners, and you prolonged period of running, and there's a lot of other factors at play.
I feel like shin splints affect a lot of beginner runners. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, for sure. I would say it's a combination of beginner runners, sometimes experienced runners also trying to like push the needle because they know sort of, okay, cool, I can do this, and they try and push a bit harder. But I think with beginner runners, it probably comes down to what we spoke about before. We know that 90% of running related injuries is due to training load. So it's the loads that their body just aren't ready for. So, it could be a combination. I'll give you two different examples. You can have someone who's new to running, but just is pretty good, pretty decent athlete. And then they are able to run, and then they keep running because it feels pretty good. Their pace is good, but then your body goes through this delayed process, and bone is like super delayed. The load that you put through today is still trying to catch up. So if you experience pain in your shin 3 months down the track, it's not what you did at that moment, but it's what you've done for the 3 to 4 months leading into it. So when someone comes in to see me in clinic, I'm peppering into their training load. One of the first things I'll say is, do you have Strava? They'll say yes. Okay, cool. And I'll have a look at that Strava progress chart. And if it looks like an ECG chart, we're just going up and down, okay, cool. We can see there's massive spikes in load. All these things are going to factor and boil into the point where you're obviously sitting in front of me. So I think you have that element of like a new runner just going into it, not deloading well enough, potentially not having enough strength within their running plan. But then you can also have the athlete who's an incredible cyclist. So let's say Ben, incredible cyclist. You then go, you have a great engine, amazing cardiovascular fitness. We know cyclists have incredible VO2 max. So you can get into running and your cardiovascular fitness is great. It's like, yeah, I can keep running. This is easy. But then your feet aren't ready for it because you've gone from a sport which is non-weight bearing to something where you're constantly impacting the ground. And, if you call it 180 steps per minute, then that's over a marathon, that's about 45 to 50,000 steps that you're impacting on that you probably weren't doing, even though you have great cardiovascular fitness. So I think the transference from different sports also coming into running as a new sport, if you're slightly a heavier runner and you're learning how to do that, say for myself coming in, if I'm trying to like push for times or trying to do things that are a little bit out of my grasp, being a heavier runner, then that's going to have undue stress on my body that it's just not ready for, it hasn't adapted to.
Yeah, I think I see that firsthand, and I'm always advising my cycling friends to avoid, which is that if you push yourself at the limit of strong muscles or a strong cardiovascular system, but you don't have the strength to tolerate that impact that comes from the running, I think like you said, the kind of first place that's going to come in is the shins. And I guess that's partially also because the calf works in such a different way that it's not used to.
Yeah.
And then those areas of pain is where the calf actually inserts, which is then that kind of like aggravation on the bone itself.
Yeah, exactly. So when you're running, like you said, your calf is one of the first muscles to work really hard to absorb shock, but then also has to work really hard to give you propulsion. So it is the hardest working running muscle in the body by a landslide. And what it does when you sort of break it down from a biomechanical perspective is when you contract your calf, that tibia bone goes through a period of like having to like take a bit of bendy load. So that inner portion, that sort of medial tibia where people get shin splints will start to take on a little bit more stress. So if it's not used to it, if your calf's not strong enough, all of a sudden that stress will then sort of reflect onto the bone. If you're looking at it from a biomechanical perspective, like I said, there's many other factors from nutrition and hormonal changes, and we're learning so much about what also underpins it. So I think that the big thing with if you're experiencing bone stress injuries, it's not just training load, like get it checked out, because there are probably things happening in an underlying perspective, especially for female runners as well, that we see a lot of with these injuries. So I think it's important to sort of preface with that as well.
And how would a runner know if it's just like a light dose of shin splints compared to like a bone stress injury?
That's a great question. Like traditionally they would say that if the area and the size of pain was larger, it's probably more for bone stress injury. If it's more focal, then it's probably more likely to be a higher level bone stress or stress fracture. I think what we're learning now is it's just too hard to predict. I think what we can do in clinic really, really well is boil down to saying you have shin splints or medial tibial stress, but we can't say for sure what that grade is until we get an MRI. 5 years ago when I would practice, I would probably go for, let's start treating this, let's manage this conservatively, and if it's not improving, we'll get an MRI. Because we're seeing so much volume and we're seeing so much variation where people with very little pain are presenting with a full-blown fracture and then people with a lot of pain just have a low grade response. And part of that comes back to what I said before, is like if you have this like inside out approach where it's manifesting through your bone marrow in through the outside of the bone, we don't know till it's too late. And then it just be like this one random run someone will do and say, oh, just did a long run on a Sunday and now it's really painful. And then if we went for that old school approach, it'd be like, yeah, it's probably just a response, but they might have a stress fracture. So I think, if we can nail that you've got shin splints of some variation, I always go down the road of like, let's get an MRI, let's quantify exactly the level of stress that you have, because we just can't tell. Pain and injury or damage is just not proportional. And it's quite a dangerous road to then just go, let's see how it goes. And these are learnings, for myself and the industry.
And what can one do to prevent shin splints? Obviously, there's,
Yeah.
like we've said already, building up your training progressively.
For sure.
Obviously bones, calcium, what can we be doing?
Yeah, so bones for sure. If you're looking at just from a bone perspective, bone mineral density, if you have a thicker bone, it's going to be more resilient towards managing and taking on more stress. And nothing builds thicker, stronger bones than resistance training. So this is where you work on specific kind of movements that bring on what we call axial load. Basically, it's things that sort of help to give the bone a bit of compression, bit of that bendy load. So it starts to stimulate those bone building cells firing up. And then obviously you start to layer in some nice healthy bone and you go through that change. For female runners, I think it's really, really important that we speak about menstrual health. If you're on any contraceptive pills or coils, that can have an implication, especially if you're on a contraceptive pill, because it might, depending on the variation of contraception you use, it can stop your period. And stopping your period means you're also having a cessation of estrogen production. And estrogen is one of the key hormones in the uptick of good bone turnover. So if you have estrogen, that comes into the bone, it says, hello, welcome. And then it starts to obviously then go through a process of adding in those bone building cells, and you get that really nice positive bone turnover. If you've got poor nutrition, that can also impact your menstrual cycle for female runners. It can also, for males as well, they can start to impact things like testosterone. So there's a lot of underlying things. The strength work, the training load is the iceberg that you see, which is only the top third of the iceberg. But then everything under the water is what a lot of people tend to sort of neglect or ignore, sometimes because of taboo. Because I think speaking about menstrual cycles, not having one, it's not something that's as commonly shared, and we're trying to really push for that at the running room. But it's something that we don't talk about as much. So we make it a common practice that we ask all of our runners questions around, if they're female runners, things around menstrual health, fueling, nutrition. If it's a male runner, we ask them things more around libido changes. Morning erection is a great sign for a male runner. If you start to lose the morning erection and you're getting it maybe once or twice a week, it means that you are in an energy deficit, which means your likelihood of picking up a bone stress injury now picks up, because your body isn't in a position where it can metabolically cope with the demands. And then you might go down that road there as well. So there's a lot of things that need to be addressed. They're quite personal things. Mm-hmm. So I think, making sure you're going to the right place. Those people are asking the questions, but you also feel safe to answer those questions because they're super private as well. Yeah.
And in terms of treatment for shin splints, so obviously you mentioned one of the key things to do is to make sure we get the accurate diagnosis via an MRI, etc. But if someone starts to notice acute symptoms of stress or pain at the base of their shin, what would you recommend?
For sure. I think firstly, see a professional, get that quantified. If you can get an MRI sooner, awesome. If you've got to wait and go through a healthcare system in your country to get one, I think still get one to ensure that everything's okay, but try and get some help there. Unfortunately, with shin splints, because it's a bone-based injury, it's probably one of the only few injuries within running where I would say you would need to stop running. So that, depending on the severity of that stress, it could be a couple weeks into 16 weeks if it's a full-blown stress fracture. Whereas if you've got a tendon injury or runner's knee, you can modify and play around with load if your pain severity is not too bad, and you can still keep training with some restrictions and modifications in place. But with stress responses, stress injuries, you would have to stop for a period of time for that bone to recover, or else it's just not going to recover, because you might give it 3 days off, feel great, and then all of a sudden you go do something on top of that, and then all those 3 days that you've sort of given it some sort of time to heal and recover starts to break down again. So your training and having to stop will be one of those things, unfortunately. We spoke about strength work. I think when we get someone coming in with stress responses, we also get them to see a sports medicine consultant or go to see their GP and get a blood test. Just make sure all your biological markers, there are some that are more specific to males versus females, but you want to just make sure all your biological markers are in a good level. Vitamin D, especially if you live in a nice sunny country like the UK, we know we'll have a big chunk of people who have a vitamin D deficiency. I have one now as well, so that's how I know I'm a proper Londoner now. I have a vitamin D deficiency, so it's something to just stay on top of. If you then go down the road of like, if someone is potentially in a state of energy deficit, then they might need to see either a nutritionist, or depending on the severity, they might need to see a clinical dietitian. And in some cases, when we're dealing with really, really complex injuries, they might also need to have a sports psychologist to come into play there as well. So it's very multifactorial. It's really nuanced, and it can be also really overwhelming. But I think just starting with get some rest, get the rehab in that rest period. The rest is from running, not from everything altogether. So whilst you're resting from running, you'll do some strength, some rehab work, and get a blood test, because you can get that done, at least in the UK, you can get that done through the healthcare system. So get a blood test, and then from there, if you're seeing a health professional, then they can guide you in the right path and say, okay, cool, you probably need to get some additional tests and scan here, but best to do it then, get that information, so that way you're armed for not getting that injury again, because we know that if you get a bone stress injury or bone stress fracture, your likelihood of getting your subsequent one in the next 12 months is over 50%. So 1 in 2 people will stress in 12 months, which is a really, really high stat. So if you spend a bit of money and energy to get it right the first time, then you're just going to do yourself a service and not have to worry about going through that heartache and that process again.
I think that talk about blood tests is really interesting as well, because I have been like really low in iron, and I'm not going to get those benefits from training really hard, because I'm not creating like the red blood cells that I need to build fitness. So it is that stripping it back to basics, get your body working in a good flow state to like work with the training you're doing.
100%. You have to create that environment for your body, right? So that's biologically, that's within the training environment. It can be the clothes you wear, the shoes you wear, like everything will factor into like, am I creating the right environment for this specific session or this particular race? It's probably no different to when you're sitting in the office and you're working. Like if you want to do some deep work, you probably just want to get a bit of isolation and quiet. But if you've got a room full of people screaming at you, you're not really going to get a lot done. So the environment isn't right there to do that work. So I think, I'd look at it in a very similar way.
The third injury we want to talk about, IT band syndrome.
Yeah.
What is IT band syndrome?
Yeah, so ITB pain, which is your iliotibial band, it's a beautiful, thick, fibrous band that lives on the outside of the knee. It's not a contractile tissue. Its primary purpose is to just sort of keep things nice and tightly packed and to create a really nice sort of like bridge between the hip and the knee. So that way you have some good control through that. So when you're getting ITB pain, it's pain on the side of the knee. It can traditionally, people would call it like this frictioning syndrome, where you hear it clicking and frictioning, but we know that's not the case anymore. You can get that in some cases, but you also can get this like kind of like sharp stabbing pain on the side of your knee. It can happen either slightly below the knee where the ITB attaches onto your shin bone, or it can happen slightly above the knee as well. And the main reason that tends to happen is going to be around probably some changes with terrain. So, if you're starting to maybe do a bit more sort of like hill-based running, if you're running typically in a place where it's really flat and level, but then you go on holiday and all of a sudden you're running on camber, so you're putting undue stress on one leg more than the other, or if it's like cobbled, then you're going to have a bit of side-to-side movement. So those things can be the impact from a training perspective, and then from a strength control perspective, once again, now you're looking at things higher up in the chain like your hip, because your ITB is attached onto your glute muscles. And if your glute muscle or your hip strength through that posterior hip is not strong enough, then that's going to have an impact with the ITB getting lengthened. You don't have as much control through the leg. And then all of a sudden that ITB starts to sort of grab you at the level of the knee.
I think the common theme with all of these injuries we've spoken about is building strength around the problem area.
For sure.
And that's to take the load off the problem area.
Yeah, definitely. I think, your muscles are there to take the force, and then the muscles will then sort of like help reduce force that goes through your joint. Your joints will take force, but if your muscles are strong enough, then it's making sure that the joint doesn't have to absorb and impact as hard, right? So you don't want to have something just constantly jarring. You want that muscle to absorb force really nicely and then take that pressure away from different tissue, whether it's joint or whether it's ITB or like that thick fibrous tissue on the side of your knee, for sure.
So does that mean that the solution to both avoiding and recovering from IT band syndrome is predominantly strength and avoiding over tightness in the glute?
Yeah, I would say strength for sure. I think, the research will show us that like strength work has the ability to reduce injury likelihood across multiple different injury sites, but also has the ability to improve performance as well. So you're getting a 2-for-1 there. And then in terms of, so what was the other thing you mentioned? Sorry.
The kind of tightness as well. Given that presumably the tighter our glute gets, the more pressure we're then putting through the IT band itself.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say tightness, because like you could have some sort of like tightness there which could impact it, but I think it's going to come down to more control and strength. So your glute med muscle, which is like the one that lives behind your big glute max muscle, is responsible for controlling, just keeping a nice level hip as you run. So if that's not doing its job, what happens is your leg starts to roll into the midline, and that creates more length and tension within the ITB. So you want to develop more stability through the hip than probably mobility. I would say that's going to be the bigger factor. We see people with really mobile hips still developing ITB. So we know that stability is going to have a more profound impact than the flexibility, mobility part to it. Not to say you don't do that, but if we're working with someone who's got ITB or has a history of ITB, I would probably focus more on stability than I would the others.
Do you have any example exercises which people could do to help ITB? Yeah,
for sure. If we're speaking lateral hip, then you can just work on isolating that muscle, that glute med muscle first. So you can do a really nice, slow, controlled side-lying leg raise, where you're working on a slow lift up and then a nice controlled lowering down. So you're building time under tension in that muscle there, because it's having to work quite hard and for quite long whilst you're running. You can work then to like shift that around, where if you're doing like say a lateral toe tap. I think we've done this in some of the content we've shot as well. So this is where you stand on one leg and you're putting all your weight through one leg, ensuring the hip, knee, and ankle are all in a straight line. So you're not letting that knee cave in, not letting that sort of like ITB tissue lengthen out too much, and you're building that stability both from a muscular perspective, but also from a motor control perspective as well. And then you're just roving the other leg, so you're just trying to work in a single leg position there. Crab walks or monster walks, also great. Just things that can fire up the side of the hip, and it's the exercise where you go, oh, I can feel that, like feels right in my glute, and that's what you want to be feeling there. I'd be focusing a lot more on those things, and just a nice general overall plan as well.
And in terms of recovery from something like IT band syndrome, we're starting to see symptoms there. What is the kind of like recommended kind of course of action? Is it like we've just spoken about all of the strength work for the glute? Is it time off running like you mentioned with shin splints or not?
Depends on the severity with time off running. So if you've got a really irritated ITB, so I'll use myself as an example. So I ran London this year. The heat got to me, messed up my gait, just kept sort of going through. And at about 28K, I could start to feel my ITB. My physio brain and my runner brain, they don't like each other. So they don't listen to each other. So I just said, I'm going to finish this. I don't care. I won my medal. So did it, finished it. But I knew my ITB was pissed off. Next morning, my ITB was so agitated and irritated that I couldn't straighten my knee or bend it. So it's almost like this little junction as you come off fully straightening your knee, where the ITB starts to like be at its highest lengthened point. I just couldn't do that. So in cases like that, obviously I couldn't run because I could barely walk. So that's pretty self-explanatory. But take, for example, you've got someone who comes in, they can feel it, but they're feeling it potentially more on like a faster run or a certain duration after a long run. We really want to try and find what that biting point is. So if you feel it at 12K and it starts to get worse thereafter, you might need to just pin back and maybe just live around the 10K mark, just still keeping volume, because we know if you strip all the volume away and you want to push it all back into the system again, then you're spiking load. So you might either flare up the actual ITB or flare up something else like a shin. So you want to try and keep as much volume in there that's safe, that you're recovering well from as you're building everything else around. Other things to focus on is the types of run that you do. So try and avoid downhill, uphill running, keep everything pretty flat. That will be a super important thing. And we spoke about camber as well. So if you're running in different parts of, your parks or wherever you are. So I'll use local park, Battersea Park, beautiful running park, one of the home of running in London. But if you're running on the edges of Battersea Park, it can kind of slope down and be quite cambered. So if you're running through Battersea Park, maybe just stay down the middle of that park versus going on the edges. So just know your environment, know where you run. Try and stay away from like maybe trail-based running where it's a bit more uneven and you're going to go side to side a little bit. Just try and keep it all pretty linear and easy in the body.
It is fascinating whereby the solve to some of the injuries is also then the flare up to the others, whereby like for shin splints, we want to minimize our impacts. We might want to run on softer terrain versus then needing to stick to something like flatter tarmac to avoid IT band syndrome. So it's an interesting one, and as a result we've probably got to listen to our body and strengthen our weaknesses and adjust our training. And it's an ebb and a flow, and we're never going to find one solution to exist for the rest of our lives, and instead it's
for sure
continuously listening, adapting and adjusting based on how it's going and how our goals change as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think you need to have a variety, right? You need to have some strength work, but then you also need to have things that work on flexibility and mobility. You need to have things that work on stability as well. Your training plan, you need to have a nice structured plan that's deloaded periodically within a training block, even if you're building a bit of base, because your body almost needs that moment to like reset a little bit so it can go again. No elite athlete is constantly going for it every single day and every single week of the year. Their bodies will break down, so they have time off and deload weeks. So we should look at it in a similar light. If the best in the world are doing it this way, what makes us think that we can go harder than them and still be okay?
Yeah. I think the overarching thing of all of this is injuries, unfortunately, are common in running because we are pushing our bodies. But one thing we haven't touched on is cross training. And that is something we can do if we are injured or just to like supplement our running. Are you a big fan of cross training?
Yeah, for sure. I think in the right environment, it definitely is. Like, you need to understand the injury. So if we speak to ITB like we did before, you can get ITB in cyclists a bit more than we see it in runners. So it's a bit more prevalent in the cycling population. So if you come off running and then you start cycling, you might potentially make that worse if you haven't got the seat set up right and things like that. So you might need something else to cross train with. So in that circumstance, we're going to be a bit more careful. But, if you're dealing with runner's knee, then you can cycle and it's not an issue. If you've got someone who's got shin splints, but there's a lot of underlying things below the water in that iceberg that need to be addressed, like an energy deficit, then cross training can happen, but it has to be very controlled to allow the body to get back into an energy surplus where it can actually perform and recover and do the things you want to. You need to bring your body back to that environment again. So yes, will be my answer, but I think with an asterisk around it. Yeah, for sure.
So say you've got the all clear from your physio and cross training works really well for you. How could you include cross training or supplement your running with cross training? Say you're not feeling great and cross training is working really well for you.
Yeah, I guess there's kind of like two options really. One of which would be to kind of like substitute a session whereby when we're looking at, let's say, a tempo workout or our training across the week, we're trying to hit during various levels of intensity, various levels of kind of like heart rate zones to spend time within. So we could substitute out a run with a cycle and look to see a similar kind of structure. Obviously, it's not always the easiest when you might have to navigate a hill here or there. But to see similar levels of kind of time spent in different zones is going to be a great way to get the equivalent cardiovascular benefit while we're not getting the same running load as a result. And obviously, we could do the same with swimming or other forms of cardiovascular exercise, whether that's using the cross trainer or step machine. But equally, something very exciting that's also coming and that's been a long time in the works in Runna HQ is the ability for you to use a new feature coming, which is called Not Feeling 100%. And so it's for you to be able to tell us in your Runna app when you've been feeling ill. You might have been kind of under the weather, had COVID, had the flu. You may well have just simply been stressed from a period of time, busy at work, etc. Or you're having kind of early stage kind of aches or pains, not a full-blown injury service, but as a way for us to adjust your training, reduce through that period of inconvenience, and then to gradually build you back up, of which that kind of return will also look different depending on why you've had a reduction in your training. So no, very much something that we also know that our runners see and want to very much continue to build the tools to help people back onto that running journey and achieving their goals.
That's a really exciting one, and I know the runner team have been working really hard on that. I'm going to segue us over into our this or that's. This is a kind of which is more beneficial quick fire, but I mean, it would be really helpful if there was a small explanation as well. For recovery, ice bath or sauna?
Oh, the tough one. I'll probably go sauna just because I'm a warm weather person, but I think they are both equally beneficial, and they need to also happen hand in hand because you're essentially changing some environments where you're also changing blood flow and things like that within your body. So the ideal situation is you probably do 10 minutes in one, if you can manage 10 minutes of ice bath, or start where you can, maybe 1 or 2 minutes, and then cycle into some heat and then sort of go in and out of the two. So I think, hand in hand, 50-50.
What is the kind of physiological reasons for spending time at hotter temperatures and cooler temperatures for those who aren't aware?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it from training, it could just depend on like the environments you're running in. Like if you're going to do a Moab, for example, you probably need to get more adapted towards heat. But if you look at it more like physiologically, when you are sort of in a position where your body's cooling down, or an ice bath for that matter, your body's going through a period of like vasoconstriction. So all your little blood vessels, things like that, like just kind of constricting a little bit. And then as soon as you go into heat, that starts to open up vasodilation. So you get this really nice reaction. It's called a hunting reaction, where your body's just kind of like pushing blood in and out and just circulating it better. So if there's areas of your muscle tissues, things like that are going through elements where you might be holding a few more sort of biomarkers, things like that, it just helps sort of flush and cycle things through. So it's just a nice way for your body to recover. There's also a really nice psychosomatic feeling to it, which I know people look at psychosomatic and go, it's more mental than anything else, but it's important that we feel good as much as it might be impacting us physiologically as well, because if you feel great, it just gives you that little burst on race day.
Got it. Both. I guess the next answer will be both too, but a little bit more of like an accessible way to recover.
Sure.
Foam rolling or massage, whether that's a self massage or seeing like a massage professional, which is more beneficial?
I would say, if from an accessibility perspective, definitely foam rolling. Like, it's a lot more cost effective. It's in your house. You can do it at any point. Blend it into your day. So I always tell people, like, do it when you're like watching TV at nighttime, spending time with your loved ones, as opposed to like having to carve out an extra 15, 20, 30 minutes in your day, which might already be busy. So my slogan is Netflix, foam roll, then chill. So that's what I go with. Always nice to have a massage. There's always a power of external touch, right? So that might be something you look to do periodically, depending on your finances and things like that. So, you might go once a fortnight if you could afford it, or you might go once every 6 weeks. But I think if you can sort of balance the two hand in hand when you focus a bit more on foam rolling, because that just means you're getting it in almost on a daily.
I would say one of the benefits of a massage, but it's actually really the case with foam rolling as well, is just by going through that process, you can identify the areas of tightness and pain, whether that's an area that is sore to spend longer on with the foam roller, or whether that's an external massage therapist identifying a knot in the quad. They will be really helpful ways for you to identify potential problem areas and prevent them becoming an injury in the future.
Yeah, definitely. That, someone having a feel through different muscles in your body you might go, okay, that's a bit sore, and I didn't know that was sore. So you're understanding those areas of soreness in terms of the actual physiological impact, in terms of what's happening with the body. We know they're doing very similar things. You're just getting a slightly different stimulus point from it. So you're changing perceptions around soreness. So, your foam roller will give you one effect from that. A massage therapist will give you another. So, one maybe not necessarily better than the other, but I think just having a variety, and it's always nice to get pampered a little bit as well, isn't it?
And last one, mobility or strength?
Unbiased strength. Like, strength always wins. Like, if you're stronger, you're just going to get far more adaptation across different areas. Doesn't mean you don't do the mobility stuff, but if I had a half an hour to do something, I would go strength over mobility.
Would you do the same?
Well, I think my answer is that I probably always would have done the strength, but I also think the mobilities feels easier. Yeah. So I think I'd also judge it based on how I'm feeling. Whereas often it might be that you don't have the energy to go and do a high intensity or a low intensity strength session, but you do have the ability to do a bit more of a relaxed stretch yoga Pilates session. I guess we haven't really spoken about the benefits of mobility. Obviously, we've spoken massively about the benefits of all the strength work. Yeah. Why should someone do mobility training within or spend time focusing on mobility within a training week or a training cycle? Yeah,
for sure. I think firstly, like when we say mobility, I think we're probably talking about like the combination of like flexibility and mobility. So flexibility is more soft tissue related, like muscle flexibility, maybe tendon flexibility. And then mobility is always joint related. So like your hip joint. So there's biologically speaking or anatomically speaking, there's only so much a joint will move per person beyond the point that you need to like operate and cut open a joint to create more range of motion, which I don't recommend. So yeah, you want to try and have as much available range of motion there to be able to like express force, right? So if you had, let's use an example of a bicep curl because it's really easy to picture. So if you didn't have full range of motion and you're trying to generate, say, 1,000 kilos of force across a multitude of reps, and you only have that much or half your range of motion in your elbow, you're going to have to do a lot more work to get that force. Whereas if you got more range of motion, you can generate a little bit more. So it just means that you can, as you're running, you just have the ability to open up more and make sure every stride and step is maximized.
Yeah.
So that would be definitely the benefit with sort of the mobility work.
And I guess obviously that makes sense. We want to be able to have a long open stride to be able to run beautifully. If we don't spend time thinking about our flexibility, will our stride or our range of motion reduce over time? So do we therefore need to be involving regular work on our flexibility to avoid seeing the adverse of that?
Yeah, for sure. I think it can. It's hard to say that it definitely will, but I think it will sort of give people that element where they just don't feel like their body is opening up as much, whether it's joint related or muscle related. And I think, yes, you should be having some element of that. Like it goes back to that rainbow analogy. If we you want to try and get a bit of everything else. There's no one thing that's like perfect for you. You want to get a bit of flexibility. You want to get a bit of mobility, stability work, strength work. They all sort of live hand in hand. So there's no like one discipline which is better than others, even though we might have our biases and preferences.
Yeah. No, I think you're completely right. And it's why if you look at any of the elite athletes, whether it's a professional doing 10,000 meter runner, marathon runner, or triathlete, they're all doing strength work. They're all doing some mobility work. They're all obviously nailing their running across multiple disciplines, taking deload weeks, doing all of that, and also cross training, assuming that that's the thing that suits them and their goals.
Yeah, I think it's been a fascinating conversation. Just as you say, like your training plan isn't just the miles you run, and I think that's something we can all learn.
My final question, the one thing we haven't touched upon, which I feel like has to be in the center of a conversation around avoiding injuries,
for sure,
is sleep.
Yeah, 100%.
Should we be sleeping?
Ideally. So sleep, for sure. Sleep is super important, right? That's one of the primary pillars when you speak about recovery and can't be substituted for anything else. So good quality sleep is essential. Research will suggest that if those people that sleep less than 7 hours a night are 50% more likely towards having injuries. So like 7 to 8 hours is like that window. So yeah, I would say definitely get sleep. Try and maximize your sleep, especially on the nights where you're leading into something that's a bit harder. But you also need to like stack the nights together, right? So it's not just like I'm doing a long run tomorrow, so I'm going to sleep well tonight. But then tomorrow I'm going to sleep crap because I'm just doing a recovery run or I'm resting altogether. Like it all builds in and it sort of goes back to something I tell a lot of my clients coming into clinic is like people just look at a training week and go, well, this week I did this and this week I did, a little bit more in terms of volume or load. But it's the same body. Like you're not changing. It's not like you're Iron Man and you get to change the suit every week to have a new suit that does the work for you. It's the same body having a stack week on week.
You take any damage from last week into the new week.
100%. That's why you have deload weeks to help sort of like take the last 4 weeks of training, make sure they're actually meaningful, get a bit of downtime so you can then build into the next sort of
And I
micro
guess
block.
the example you said as well, which is, let's do a good night's sleep tonight because we've got a long run tomorrow. That long run, you're going to be taking on enormous amount of impact. You might be doing 20, 30,000 steps. You might be stressing your IT band. You might be aggravating your patellar tendonitis or whatever it's going to be. You need to be recovering from that long run just as much as preparing for it.
For sure.
And therefore, there's probably no night that you can neglect, and consistent 8 hours sleep is the answer.
I would agree. Like, I think that sort of makes me think about something which I hear a lot of my sort of like mentors speak about, and you hear in the running world, it's like, it's the sessions you recover from, which are the great sessions, not the sessions that you don't recover from. So if you do like an incredible interval session, like you hit all your times, but then you feel like crap for 4 days, that's actually not a great session. The session that is great is like you hit all those times, and then you can back up and you can carry on with the rest of your training week. Like, that is a great session there, because everything within the body, both from a running perspective, your sleep, nutrition, accessory bits, everything is working together to put you in that position where you're performing optimally.
Yeah, and it's just compounding the time really as well. It's that you might go and do that absolutely savage interval session, but you need multiple days and weeks of good sleep and time, reducing the intensity to be able to adapt to that, to then be able to go and demonstrate the improved fitness from that. And so therefore, we need to pass the time, we need to eat well, we need to sleep well, and we need to do all of those other bits in that interim to then be able to benefit from that good training.
Definitely, yeah.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a very valuable episode for me and our listeners. Thank you for coming on.
No, it's my pleasure.
Hey guys, this episode is brought to you by the Runna app, the #1 rated running coaching service worldwide. If you want to try the app today, use code podcast25 for 2 weeks totally for free. And please do remember to rate, follow, and subscribe to us on your listening platform to help us climb the rankings and so that we can keep bringing you the most interesting and amazing guests.